This story is a fictional work created for entertainment. It does not depict real people, real events, or official military actions. The morning air at Fort Cavazos felt sharp and clean, the kind that wakes you before coffee ever could, and I stood at parade rest on the edge of the unit auditorium lights, warming the polished floor as rows of uniforms settled into silence. I am Sarah Whitmore, 32 years old, and I had learned to breathe through moments like this the way you learn to breathe through pain, steady, measured, invisible. My dress uniform sat heavy on my shoulders, not from the ribbons, but from the weight of what today meant. Months of preparation leadership during a brutal training cycle. Nights spent rewriting plans after others went home, a near miss on a live lane, where a young soldier froze, and I stepped in without thinking. The packet was clean, the endorsements solid, and this ceremony was supposed to mark something simple that the work had been seen and recorded correctly. When my name echoed, I felt that familiar surge pride without noise, relief, without celebration, and I stepped forward, eyes fixed ahead, because protocol matters, especially when your family never respected boundaries. That was when I saw him. My stepfather seated 2 rows back beside his daughter, my stepsister, her posture careful, her expression rehearsed. I had not invited them, but family invitations are automatic in units like ours, and I had told myself it would be fine because I had learned how to be the easy one. The general had not yet revealed himself. He sat among the senior leaders, quiet, watchful, a presence you feel before you recognize it. The microphone clicked, the applause rose, and then the scrape of a chair cut through the room like a blade. My stepfather stood before anyone could stop him, his voice loud, confident the way it always sounded when he wanted to own a room. He said the words I still hear in my bones. She did not do this alone. My daughter guided the planning, she deserves the credit, and you could feel the oxygen leave the space. I did not turn my head. I did not react. I did not correct him. I stood perfectly still because I knew exactly what was happening and because years of living with him had taught me that arguing only fed the lie. My stepsister looked down, then up, then down again, as if surprise could be practiced. Murmurs rippled, boots shifted, a senior NCO inhaled sharply, and someone behind me whispered my last name like a question. The general did not move. He watched. In that suspended second, I felt the old reflex try to take over the one that told me to make it smooth, to absorb the damage, to keep things from getting messy. I felt the heat rise in my chest, not anger, not yet, but a cold clarity. The truth did not need my voice right now, it needed the room. I could hear my heartbeat slow the way it does when a plan locks into place. My stepfather kept talking, adding details that did not exist, reaching for validation that did not belong to him, and I let the silence work because silence can be evidence. The applause had died completely, and every eye was now on him, not on me. That was the twist he never saw coming. Authority does not rush, and justice in uniform does not shout. I stayed at attention, jaw set, hands still knowing the cameras were on, the recorders were rolling, and the chain of command had everything it needed. When the general finally stood, the room changed temperature without a word spoken, and in that instant, I understood that the moment my stepfather chose to steal credit in front of my unit was the moment he surrendered control. If this happened in front of everyone you work with, would you speak up or stay silent? When my mother remarried, I was 9, old enough to notice details and young enough to be taught which ones to ignore, and the first thing everyone said about my stepfather was how respectable he seemed. He shook hands firmly, smiled at the right moments, fixed things around the house without being asked, and spoke about responsibility as if it were a personal creed. Neighbors approved, teachers relaxed, and relatives praised my mother for choosing stability after years of quiet struggle. On the surface, he was exactly what people hope for when a family starts over, and that surface became his shield. He had a daughter from his first marriage, my stepsister Emily, who arrived every other weekend with a suitcase full of outfits and expectations, and from the beginning, the rules bent around her presence. It was subtle enough to deny and constant enough to shape me. Emily got the bigger bedroom because she needed space to feel welcome. Emily chose dinner because transitions were hard. Emily got new supplies because her school mattered and mine would manage. I learned the math early attention was limited and he decided where it went. He never raised his voice, and that was the trick because cruelty delivered calmly looks like reason. When teachers complimented my grades, he nodded once and said good job before turning to ask Emily how she felt about her day. When I asked to join an after-school club, he said maybe next year and paid for Emily to attend dance classes because she had potential. He praised her confidence and framed my quiet as maturity. At dinner, he told stories about her achievements, and if my mother tried to add one of mine, he redirected with a gentle hand on her wrist and a comment about not putting pressure on me. "You are strong, Sarah," he would say with a smile that closed the conversation. "You do not need the spotlight." That sentence became a rule I followed without knowing it was a rule. Being strong meant not asking. Being strong meant smoothing things over. Being strong meant watching opportunities pass and telling myself it was fine. At school, I learned to excel without expecting applause. And at home, I learned to make myself small without resentment because resentment was dangerous and pointless. My mother noticed pieces of it, but she was tired and grateful, and he never gave her anything concrete to confront. He paid bills on time, showed up to events for Emily, and spoke kindly in public. If I looked disappointed, he framed it as my choice. "You said you were fine," he would remind me later when my mother was not around, and I would nod because correcting him felt like a betrayal of the calm he curated. The favoritism was not loud, but it was total. Holidays followed the same pattern. Gifts Emily wanted arrived wrapped and perfect, while mine were practical and praised for their usefulness. Family photos centered her smile while I was angled to the side, the reliable frame that made the picture work. When extended family visited, he paraded her accomplishments and referred to me as independent, which sounded like admiration until you live inside it and realize it means unattended. If Emily failed a test, he advocated and called the school. If I failed one, he asked what I could do better. If Emily cried, he soothed. If I cried, he explained why it was unnecessary. My mother asked me once if I minded sharing a college savings contribution so Emily could attend a summer program, and I said no because saying yes felt easier than naming the pattern and because I had learned that asking for fairness would cost more than it gained. That was the lesson of that house. Fairness was negotiable, strength was mandatory. He never said he loved Emily more, but he structured the world so that she mattered first and then told me that mattered because it proved I could handle things. The house ran on that logic, and it shaped how I moved through it quietly, efficiently, invisible when needed. I learned to anticipate needs before they became problems and to absorb disappointment without complaint. When friends asked why I did not get excited about awards, I told them I did not need attention, and they believed me because I said it like a fact. When teachers suggested I apply for scholarships that required recommendations, I hesitated because attention felt like debt. At home, he used my compliance as evidence that everything was fine, and my mother used my calm as proof that the marriage worked. The sentence repeated whenever I edged toward wanting more. "You are strong. You do not need the spotlight." It sounded like praise and functioned like a lock. By the time I was a teenager, I had perfected being the easy one, the daughter who did not complicate dinners or budgets or narratives. Emily grew comfortable being centered, and he grew confident that I would stay where he placed me. That confidence followed him into every room and later into the room where he tried to take credit for my work because he believed the rule still applied, that my strength existed to make his version of the story easier to tell. I left home at 21, not in a rush and not in rebellion, but with the quiet certainty that staying would keep shrinking me until there was nothing left to protect, and the Army recruiter office in Killeen felt like air after years underground. I did not tell my stepfather my plans until the paperwork was signed because I had learned how he rewrote intentions into obligations, and I wanted one decision that stayed mine. The military did not promise kindness or comfort, and that honesty mattered. It promised rules that applied to everyone, boundaries you could point to, and a record that spoke when you did not. At basic training, I learned quickly that volume did not equal authority and that clarity carried weight. You stood where you were told you moved when directed, and your work lived on paper and in after-action reviews that could be checked by anyone willing to read. It was the opposite of home, where the loudest narrative won and the calmest person absorbed the loss. In uniform, I was not the easy one. I was accountable, and accountability cut both ways. If I did the work, it was documented, and if I did not, it showed. That fairness felt radical. My name was printed on rosters and evaluations, and no one replaced it with someone else's because they could not. When a drill sergeant called Whitmore, it was me who stepped forward, and the correction or praise landed exactly where it belonged. The first time I earned a simple counseling statement for doing something right, I stared at my name at the top longer than necessary because it felt unreal to see it there without a footnote. The Army did not ask me to make things smooth. It asked me to make them right. I learned to draw lines without apology because the line was the line. I learned to say no without explaining my childhood because the mission did not care and the mission should not. Training was hard in the honest way, hard that builds instead of erodes. When you failed in daylight with witnesses, and when you succeeded, the record followed you. I discovered that I could breathe inside that structure because nothing required me to disappear. My first unit reinforced it. Expectations were written, briefed, and repeated. If a plan changed, it was updated, and if someone tried to take credit that was not theirs, the paperwork corrected them. I began to trust systems again, not blindly but practically, trusting that if I showed up prepared and stayed consistent, the file would tell the truth. That trust let me sleep. It let me think. It let me imagine a future that did not hinge on managing someone else's comfort. Promotions did not depend on how easy I made dinners or how quietly I swallowed disappointment. They depended on performance. I worked harder than necessary at first because old habits die slowly, and I expected punishment for wanting more. Instead, I found mentorship. Leaders corrected me when I overextended and told me to stop carrying work that was not mine. They said things like delegate and document, and they meant it. For the first time, adults set boundaries for me and expected me to honor them. That did something profound. It taught me that strength could include rest and that fairness did not require me to step aside. When I sent a letter home after my first major evaluation, my stepfather replied with congratulations that sounded polite and hollow, and then asked if I could help Emily with an application. I did not answer right away, and nothing collapsed. The distance was doing its job. The Army gave me a language for that distance. Terms like chain of command and scope of responsibility were not emotional, they were practical. I began to use them in my own thinking. "That is not my lane" became a sentence I allowed myself to say, even when no one was listening. In field problems and staff meetings, my contributions were attributed to me because attribution mattered. If a plan worked, my name stayed attached to it, and if it did not, I owned the correction. There was dignity in that symmetry. I realized how much energy I had spent translating myself at home, and how little energy the Army demanded for the same recognition. Halfway through my first enlistment, I stood in a hallway reading an award citation that included my full name and specific actions, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I had been bracing since childhood. This was what breathing felt like. Have you ever left home just to breathe? I re-enlisted not because the work was easy, but because the rules were clear and the record was honest. Each year reinforced the difference. At home, praise had been a ceiling in uniform, it was a floor you built on. I learned to accept credit without shrinking and to redirect praise only when it belonged elsewhere. I learned that silence could be strategic and that speaking could be procedural, not personal. Those lessons followed me forward, and they mattered later when my stepfather tried to drag old rules into a place where they did not apply. The Army had already taught me how to stand inside my name and let the system do what it was designed to do. Military credit is not a vague compliment or a feeling you carry home, it is a trail, and I learned that early because the trail is what protects the truth when someone decides to rewrite it. My work lived in documents and evaluation narrative that captured scope and impact, an award packet that listed actions dates, witnesses, a leadership note signed and archived. Those things mattered because they could be checked and because they did not care who told the loudest story. During that cycle, I owned the training plan start to finish. I built the schedule around constraints others missed, balanced range time against maintenance windows, coordinated instructors, tracked risk, and rewrote lanes after weather shifted the ground. I wrote the after-action report myself because I was the one awake at midnight compiling lessons learned, and I did it cleanly with metrics and outcomes, not adjectives. When a junior leader froze on a live iteration, I stepped in, corrected safely, and documented the corrective training without theatrics. When an inspection flagged gaps, I closed them before close of business and recorded the fix. The packet reflected that reality, and my chain endorsed it because it matched their notes. That is how credit works when it is honest. My stepfather did not understand any of that because he never had to. He understood storytelling. He understood proximity. He understood how to place a name near a result and let people assume the rest. In his version, my stepsister Emily had guided planning from the sidelines, had offered insights, had been a steady influence. None of it existed on paper, and that did not stop him. He told it with confidence at dinners and on calls, and he did it early before the record reached the room. He said things like, "She helped shape the plan, and she has a natural leadership instinct," and people nodded because confidence is persuasive when no one checks. He leaned on familiarity and on the old rule that my strength meant I would not object. The twist was that the Army does not run on familiarity, it runs on files. Still, he tried to bend the narrative by bending the audience. He emailed distant relatives summaries that sounded official. He used phrases he had heard me use and stripped them of context. He presented Emily as the face of effort because faces photograph better than footnotes. He assumed I would keep quiet because I always had. I watched the story drift farther from the documents, and I did nothing outwardly because timing matters and because I knew the trail was intact. I kept copies of emails, calendar invites, range reservations, instructor confirmations, and the signed leadership note that spelled out who did what. I kept witness lists, not to weaponize, but to anchor. At home, he praised Emily loudly for initiatives she did not take, and told my mother it was good for me not to chase attention. "You are strong," he said again, and the sentence landed like a test. I passed it by, refusing to argue, and by preparing instead. When the award packet circulated internally, the language was precise and my name appeared where it belonged. That was when he accelerated. He showed up unannounced to a pre-ceremony gathering and spoke as if he were clarifying confusion. He suggested shared credit and implied that teamwork meant blurring authorship. Teamwork in uniform does not erase ownership, it defines it, and he did not know the difference. He counted on social pressure and on my silence. He underestimated the record. The closer the ceremony came, the more his story hardened. He repeated it until it sounded inevitable, and inevitability is a powerful drug. He believed that if enough people heard it, the truth would feel rude. That belief is common in families like ours. It fails in systems built to verify. I felt the old reflex tug again to smooth things over, to accept the lesser share and keep peace. I let it pass. I focused on the file. I checked that the evaluation narrative matched the after-action report line by line. I confirmed the award packet endorsements were complete. I ensured the leadership note included dates, signatures, and impact statements. I did not add drama because drama is a distraction. When people asked me casually about the plan, I answered with facts and pointed them to the documents without commentary. The contrast did the work for me. He told a story, I provided a trail. On the morning of the ceremony, when he stood and tried to claim credit in front of my unit, he believed the story had won. He believed that volume beats verification. He did not know that the verification had already arrived and that the audience was trained to listen for it. The ceremony unfolded the way these mornings always do, with the sun cutting clean lines across the parade field windows, dust floating in the light like quiet witnesses, and the sound of boots finding position in practiced unison. The microphone hummed once, then settled, and the air carried that mix of polish and anticipation that only unit events have, where pride is formal and feelings are held in check. I stood where I was placed, shoulders square, eyes forward, hands still, because stillness is a language the Army understands. The senior leaders took their seats, the flags framed the room, and the cadence of the program moved with deliberate calm. When names were read, the room responded in waves, measured, respectful, and contained. I felt present inside my body in a way that comes from preparation, not nerves. Then the scrape of a chair cut against the rhythm, and the sound carried farther than it should have, because silence amplifies intrusion. My stepfather rose again, this time more certain, more expansive, as if the space had invited him. He leaned toward the microphone without being called and spoke with the ease of someone used to rooms bending for him. He went beyond implication and into assertion, saying my stepsister had driven the effort, that she had guided the work, that she deserved recognition alongside mine. He used words like led and designed and critical, and with each one, the temperature dropped. The microphone did its job faithfully, carrying every syllable to the back row where young soldiers sat straight, unsure whether to look at him or at me. The sunlight did not soften the moment it sharpened it, highlighting the crease of his jacket, the set of his jaw, the confidence that assumed agreement. A low murmur moved through the unit, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to register disbelief. Someone shifted weight. Someone else inhaled sharply. A leader 2 seats over tightened his grip on the program. I did not move. I did not glance back. I did not correct him. I felt the old instinct try to pull me toward apology, and I anchored instead to the protocol that protects everyone. Interruptions are handled by authority, not emotion, and this was not my lane to police in real time. I focused on the flags and let the room do what rooms trained for truth do when a lie enters them. The murmur grew, then stilled, as people recognized the overreach. He kept going, adding color where there was none and credit where the record said otherwise. Each sentence stretched the gap between his story and the facts, and the gap made people uncomfortable in the right way. I sensed the general before I saw him shift because authority changes posture around it. He remained seated, watching, listening, allowing the process to reveal itself. Cameras captured the scene and the microphones archived it, and that mattered more than any rebuttal I could have offered. I stood because standing was the loudest response available to me. The words kept coming, and with them a subtle change in the room, from confusion to resolve. This was no longer awkward, it was inappropriate, and everyone knew it. The program stalled not officially, but practically, as attention locked onto the breach. When he finally paused expecting affirmation, he did not get it. What he got was silence, heavy and exact. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat and attempted to steer the program back on course, but the damage was done and the truth had time to arrive. I felt my pulse slow the way it does when a decision is confirmed. This was not about me defending myself. It was about the system correcting a public error in public. I had prepared for this, not with speeches, but with documentation and witnesses and patience. The unit watched me watch forward, and the choice registered. I was not weak for staying silent. I was disciplined. The general stood at last, not to speak yet, but to signal that the moment would be handled, and the signal carried weight because it came from rank, not rage. My stepfather looked around as if seeking agreement, and found none. The sunlight that had seemed warm moments earlier now felt exposing. He tried to soften his tone, to retreat without retracting, and that half-step only deepened the offense. The murmur had stopped entirely, replaced by a stillness that asked for resolution. I held my posture and let the truth take the stage on its own time. Would you have corrected him or let the truth speak later? Silence is not absence. It is a choice, and in uniform, it can be the most disciplined one available. I did not respond in that room because protocol exists to protect order, and because I understood exactly how records work. Ceremonies are recorded microphones, archive sound, cameras capture angles, and attendance rosters log who was present. Interrupting would have turned a procedural violation into a personal exchange, and personal exchanges blur lines that procedures clarify. I stayed still because stillness keeps the lane clear. I also stayed still because I knew the truth was already speaking in formats louder than my voice. The packet had been routed weeks earlier through channels that do not forget. Evaluations sit in systems designed to compare drafts, timestamps, and signatures. Emails leave trails, memos log approvals, and witnesses remember what they saw when they are asked properly. I trusted that architecture because I had learned to build within it. After the ceremony ended and the room dispersed, I did not seek confrontation. I returned to my office, closed the door, and began the quiet work that follows a breach. I opened my inbox and pulled the thread that contained the original tasking email, assigning me lead responsibility with dates and scope. I saved it locally and printed a copy because redundancy is not paranoia, it is practice. I opened the memo that documented the mid-cycle adjustment approved by my commander and checked the header for routing and time. I verified the after-action report submission time and compared it against the inspection note that referenced it. Each document confirmed the same story without embellishment. I compiled a witness list not as an accusation, but as a resource. names, ranks, roles, locations, and what each person could attest to based on presence, not opinion. I included the instructor who signed off on the lane correction, the maintenance chief who confirmed the schedule change, the platoon sergeant who observed the corrective training. I added the master of ceremonies and the public affairs officer because they controlled the recording and the release. I did not include family because family muddies process. I labeled the file clearly and dated it. I wrote a brief summary for myself not to persuade anyone, but to ensure consistency if questions came. It contained facts, only what happened when, where, and who approved. No adjectives, no speculation. That restraint mattered because emotional language invites emotional rebuttal. I then waited. Waiting is not passive when you know what you are waiting for. The chain of command does not move at the speed of outrage, it moves at the speed of verification. That afternoon, a senior leader asked me to confirm the packet version number, and I provided it without commentary. Another asked whether there had been any shared authorship, and I pointed to the leadership note that specified roles. Each answer stayed inside the file. I felt the old pull to explain myself, to soften the situation, to make it easier for others to digest, and I refused it. The easy one does not survive in processes built to be exact. Silence allowed others to see the mismatch without me framing it for them. It also denied my stepfather the conflict he expected. He reached out by text later that evening with a message that sounded conciliatory but was not. He wrote that things had gotten misunderstood and that I should help clarify to keep peace. I did not respond. Peace that requires distortion is not peace, it is maintenance, and I had resigned from that role years earlier. I saved the message with a timestamp. I added it to the file because context matters and because attempts to influence outcomes belong on the record when they intersect with official events. The next day, I was asked to provide the witness list, and I did so promptly with the note that these individuals could confirm the documented actions. I did not accuse, I offered access. The difference is everything. As the process unfolded, I noticed a shift in how people interacted with me. Not pity, not curiosity, but respect for restraint. Leaders appreciate when you let them lead. They appreciate when you do not force them to choose between decorum and truth. My silence had created space for authority to act without theatrics. I felt steadier each hour because the outcome no longer depended on how persuasive I could be. It depended on whether the record held, and it did. I slept that night without rehearsing conversations for the first time in days because there was nothing to rehearse. The system would ask what it needed, and I would provide it. That is how intentional silence works. It is not hiding, it is alignment. It keeps you inside your name and inside your lane while the truth does its work. Authority does not announce itself when it begins to work, and that is something you learn by watching how senior leaders move through rooms without disturbing them. The man who had been seated among the senior officers that morning was not simply another attendee. He was the post commander, a division general whose presence recalibrates a space even when he says nothing. I did not know his name then, but I recognized the posture, the way conversations angled toward him, the way aides hovered without hovering. He did not intervene during the ceremony because intervention at the wrong moment creates noise, and noise obscures facts. Instead, he observed the breach allowed the program to conclude and let the record form. That afternoon, his office sent a quiet request through my chain asking for the original packet version numbers, the evaluation narrative, and the endorsements as routed. The message was precise and unadorned. Provide documentation for review. No accusations, no urgency, no commentary. I replied with the requested files attached, labeled and dated, and CC'd my immediate commander because transparency matters when authority is involved. The next request followed shortly after asking for the chain of command review path who approved what and when and whether any amendments had been made after submission. I provided the routing slips and confirmation emails that showed the sequence intact. The general did not contact me directly, and that distance was intentional. Direct contact can be interpreted as pressure, and pressure compromises outcomes. Instead, he tasked his staff to compare the packet against recordings and witness accounts. The process moved in parallel, not in confrontation. I continued my duties as scheduled because nothing undermines credibility like visible agitation. In staff meetings, leaders asked neutral questions and noted answers. No one speculated. The general also requested the public affairs archive from the ceremony and the attendance roster to identify who was present when the statement was made. That level of detail signaled seriousness. This was not about feelings, it was about an inappropriate attempt to influence recognition within a military context. He allowed time for the picture to resolve because hasty conclusions fail reviews. Over the next days, my commander briefed me on the scope of the review, not to reassure me, but to ensure accuracy. He emphasized that the general would not tolerate interference from outside parties and that the focus would remain on the integrity of the process. I appreciated the clarity because it removed uncertainty. At no point was I asked to defend myself verbally. The file did that work. The general requested confirmation from the approving authority on the leadership note and received it. He requested the original training plan drafts and saw the progression in my hand. He requested the after-action report metadata and matched timestamps. Each request closed a door on alternative narratives without opening new ones. I sensed the shift across the post as rumors quieted and facts took their place. When authority notices it does not broadcast, it verifies. I was careful not to share updates beyond need to know because commentary becomes leverage for people who should not have it. My stepfather attempted again to reach me through my mother, this time framing his earlier words as supportive and misunderstood. I did not respond, and my commander advised me not to because the review was active. That advice mattered because it kept the lane clear. The general then requested a formal chain of command review summary outlining the approval process and any deviations. My commander submitted it with attachments and no editorial language. The general read it personally. I know this because his aide asked one follow-up question that only someone who had read closely would ask. It was about a line item in the training plan that demonstrated foresight. That line belonged to me, and it mattered because it showed leadership beyond execution. Authority had noticed not just the breach, but the work. He did not rush to correct the public record because corrections are strongest when they are complete. He waited until the review concluded and until the appropriate forum could address it without creating spectacle for its own sake. That patience protected the institution and the people in it. I felt steadier knowing that the decision would be grounded and durable. When the general finished his review, he instructed that the findings be briefed to the command team and that a unit-level forum be scheduled to address the issue transparently. He did not frame it as punishment. He framed it as correction. In that distinction lies real power. Authority had noticed, and it had chosen process over drama, and in doing so, it had already answered the question of whose credit stood. The investigation did not arrive with sirens or speeches, and that was the point. Because truth survives best in quiet rooms where it can be examined without interruption. The general directed a methodical review that unfolded behind closed doors with staff trained to read patterns others miss. They began with the basics not to catch anyone, but to establish a baseline. Versions of the evaluation narrative were laid side by side and compared for consistency, not just in wording but in rhythm, because authentic documents carry the same cadence across drafts. My language stayed stable, focused on scope, actions, and outcomes, while the alternate story introduced phrases that appeared nowhere else. Handwriting was examined on the leadership note and supporting memoranda because signatures are more than names, they are habits. The loops, the pressure, the spacing all matched mine, and the approving authority where expected and matched no one else. Timestamps told their own story in the metadata showing when files were created, edited, and submitted, and the sequence aligned with training milestones that could be corroborated by range logs and maintenance schedules. Nothing had been altered after submission, and nothing had been appended quietly. Narrative consistency mattered most because lies wobble when placed under parallel light. The staff traced each claimed contribution to a corresponding document and found the trail clean. When a claim lacked a document, it stopped there. They listened to witness statements not as opinions, but as confirmations of presence and action. Each witness described the same sequence independently because the sequence was real. No one embellished. No one needed to. The recordings from the ceremony were transcribed and time-coded, and the moment my stepfather spoke was isolated and reviewed against protocol. The breach was clear because context matters, and he had not been invited to speak nor authorized to alter attribution. The review noted that he was a civilian with no standing to influence official recognition and that his statements created confusion in a formal setting. The staff did not attribute motive because motive is not required to correct a violation. They documented effect. As the days passed, the picture resolved without drama. The facts aligned across sources, and the alignment was decisive. My commander was asked to answer a small number of clarifying questions and did so succinctly. At no point did anyone suggest shared credit because shared credit requires shared documentation and none existed. The truth did not need advocacy. It revealed itself by agreeing with itself. The general reviewed the findings and approved the summary. He then decided on the appropriate venue for correction because corrections have weight when delivered where the error occurred. He chose a unit forum not to embarrass for entertainment, but to restore accuracy publicly because the misstatement had been public. That choice respected the soldiers who had witnessed the moment and deserved clarity. Meanwhile, the investigation concluded without my participation beyond the initial document provision, and that restraint mattered because it kept the outcome unassailable. I continued my duties and let routine anchor me because routine prevents narrative creep. People noticed that nothing changed in my behavior and that steadiness signaled confidence in the process. My stepfather attempted one last indirect reach through an acquaintance, suggesting that the issue could be smoothed if I clarified his intent. The staff logged the attempt and moved on because intent does not rewrite records. When the general finalized the briefing, he instructed that it focus on attribution standards and the importance of respecting protocol. Names would be used where necessary to correct the record and omitted where unnecessary to avoid collateral harm. That balance reflected leadership. The truth had surfaced not because anyone shouted, but because the evidence agreed with itself across handwriting timestamps and narrative consistency. In systems designed to verify lies, fail quietly and completely. The command briefing was scheduled with the same calm precision as any other mandatory formation, and that normalcy carried weight because extraordinary corrections should not look theatrical. The unit assembled in the auditorium where the earlier breach had occurred, sunlight again cutting across the floor flags steady at the front, and the microphones tested once and then left alone. I took my seat with the rest of the formation, not at the front, not singled out, because justice does not require staging. When the general entered the room, stood rose, and settled into a silence that felt heavier than applause. He began without preamble, his voice, even his cadence deliberate the way it is when the point is clarity, not persuasion. He stated that the purpose of the briefing was to correct the record regarding recent recognition, and to reinforce standards of attribution and protocol. He did not raise his volume. He did not signal emotion. Authority does not need either. He summarized the review in plain language, noting that documentation, witness accounts, and recordings had been examined and that the findings were consistent across sources. Then he said my name, Sarah Whitmore, and confirmed that the work recognized belonged to me alone as documented in the evaluation narrative award packet and leadership note. The words landed cleanly and final. He explained that teamwork remains essential, but that credit must follow documented responsibility because accuracy protects trust. He then addressed the breach directly, stating that a civilian had attempted to influence attribution during a formal ceremony, and that such interference is inappropriate and unacceptable within a military context. He did not speculate on intent. He stated effect. He identified my stepfather by name and clarified that his statements were incorrect and had no standing. The room did not move. No murmurs, no shifting, no whispers. Silence took hold, the kind that happens when truth removes ambiguity. My stepfather sat rigid, his earlier confidence absent his name, now attached to the word incorrect in front of the same audience he had tried to sway. The general continued, noting that the correction was being made publicly because the error had been public and that accuracy owed it to the soldiers present. He emphasized that no further commentary was required and that administrative steps would follow to prevent recurrence. He concluded by restating the standard and dismissing the formation. The silence persisted a moment longer than necessary. Then the room exhaled in unison as people stood and filed out with the disciplined quiet that follows clarity. I remained seated until directed to move because protocol matters even after justice arrives. I did not look back. I did not look for reactions. I did not need to. The correction had been complete. Outside the auditorium, the air felt different, lighter, not because anything had been taken away, but because something had been put back where it belonged. My stepfather did not approach me. He could not. The general had closed the space. Later that day, a brief notice circulated reinforcing attribution standards and reminding families of boundaries at official events. It did not mention names because names had already been addressed where it mattered. Colleagues met my eyes with quiet respect and then returned to work because work is the point. I felt no triumph, only relief and a steady calm that comes from alignment. The public truth had been spoken by the only voice that needed to speak. Do you believe public truth is the only real justice? The consequences arrived without spectacle because administrative action is designed to correct, not to entertain, and that restraint gave the outcome its gravity. Within days, a formal notice was issued through proper channels clarifying access boundaries for non-service members at official events. My stepfather's name appeared on a restricted list that limited attendance to public ceremonies only when explicitly invited and prohibited participation in any forum where recognition or attribution occurred. He lost credentials he had never officially earned the casual access that comes from being seen as harmless, familiar, and unquestioned. There was no announcement and no commentary, just a quiet tightening of doors that once opened easily for him. The unit updated its family access procedures and public affairs, revised guest briefings to reinforce boundaries. These changes were framed as standard practice improvements, which they were, but everyone understood why they had become necessary. My stepfather attempted to attend a smaller recognition later that month and was stopped politely at the entrance by staff who checked the list and explained the policy without judgment. He left without argument because there was nothing to argue with. The rule existed and it applied. That is how honor falls when it loses its scaffolding. He was also removed from invitation lists for upcoming unit events, including promotions and award nights, not as punishment, but as prevention. Influence requires proximity, and proximity was no longer available. The administrative memo that documented the interference was filed and closed with recommendations to prevent recurrence, and that closure mattered because it meant the institution had resolved the issue. No ongoing investigation, no lingering rumor. Just a corrected record and adjusted access. People noticed the absence not because it was announced, but because it was consistent. When someone is no longer present where they once insisted on being, the room recalibrates. My mother called me once, her voice careful, asking whether something could be done to smooth things over. I told her that the matter had been handled and that there was nothing for me to add. That answer was true, and it ended the conversation. At work, the impact was subtle but real. Leaders moved with renewed confidence, knowing that boundaries would be enforced. Junior soldiers saw that protocol protects them too, and that credit theft has consequences even when it comes wrapped as family pride. No one gossiped because there was nothing left to interpret. The record was clear, and the access changes spoke for themselves. My stepfather's social standing shifted quietly. Invitations from others slowed because association carries risk when boundaries have been violated. He learned that reputation is not what you say about yourself, but what remains when systems stop bending. I felt the weight lift not because someone had fallen, but because the imbalance had been corrected. There was no apology demanded, and none offered because apologies are not substitutes for consequences. The Army had done what it does best when allowed to function properly. It had aligned policy with practice and moved on. I returned to my routines, training, mentoring, planning, and found that my energy returned to the work where it belonged. Honor does not need applause to exist, and dishonor does not need drama to reveal itself. When access disappears and invitations end, the message is understood. The aftermath was quiet and complete, and that completeness was the justice. Reputation does not collapse in a single sound. It thins and then disappears like ice under steady warmth, and I watched it happen without satisfaction because watching someone lose standing is not the same as winning peace. The family fracture came quietly, first in pauses where conversations used to flow, then in invitations that never arrived. My stepfather stopped being consulted, stopped being deferred, to stopped being the man whose opinion set the tone at gatherings. People adjusted around him the way they do when certainty evaporates. No one confronted him directly because reputations rarely die by confrontation, they die by avoidance. My mother tried to hold things together out of habit more than hope, and her efforts only highlighted the split. She asked people to understand, and people nodded and changed the subject. Understanding is easy when it costs nothing. Trust costs more, and it was gone. Emily felt it before she named it. She began to arrive at events already defensive, smiling too quickly, offering explanations no one asked for. Eyes lingered on her a second longer than before, not unkind but evaluating, as if recalculating an equation that had been wrong. She had benefited from a story that was no longer available, and that absence changed how people interpreted her presence. Compliments thinned. Praise became careful. Opportunities that once seemed inevitable required proof. She asked me once whether I was happy now, and I told her I was calm, which was true. Calm does not require someone else to be diminished. My stepfather tried to reclaim footing by doubling down on civility, hosting dinners, sending notes speaking about lessons learned without naming them. It did not work because credibility does not return on schedule. The same people who once leaned in now leaned away, not in anger, but in self-protection. Social circles reorganized themselves quietly, and he found fewer places where his voice mattered. That loss unsettled him more than public correction because it removed leverage. At family gatherings, he spoke less, and when he did, his words landed without echo. Emily noticed and mirrored him becoming smaller, more careful, and in that reflection, I saw the cost of borrowed credit when the lender calls it back. I did not celebrate the shift because celebration would have kept me tied to the outcome, and I wanted distance. I focused on work and on building routines that did not require reaction. When relatives asked me privately what had happened, I told them the record had been corrected, and that was all. I did not retell the story because retelling extends its life. My mother struggled the most, caught between loyalty and reality, and I set boundaries gently but firmly. I told her I would not revisit the issue and that I loved her without conditions. That clarity helped even when it hurt. Over time, the family narrative changed not to absolution, but to acceptance. People adjusted expectations and moved on. The collapse was complete when my stepfather stopped being invited into decisions that once defaulted to him. He was no longer the mediator, the fixer, the authority by familiarity. He became a participant like anyone else, subject to the same checks, and that equality felt like loss to him because it replaced privilege with parity. Emily faced her own reckoning, learning to stand on documentation rather than assumption. I did not intervene because growth requires friction. I watched without judgment because judgment would have bound me to the past. At work, my reputation held steady because it had been built on files and follow-through. That steadiness contrasted sharply with the erosion at home, and the contrast taught me something final. Status granted by bending rules cannot survive when rules stand up. I felt no urge to gloat because gloating seeks witnesses, and I sought quiet. The collapse did not give me joy, but it gave me space, and space is what I had left for at 21 to breathe. Now it returned in a different form, the space to live without managing anyone else's story. Healing did not arrive as a victory lap or a sudden lightness. It arrived as permission to be honest with myself without rehearsing defenses. I began therapy not because I was broken, but because I wanted language for what had happened and a place where my reactions could exist without being minimized. The therapist did not dramatize my story, and that mattered. She listened for patterns and named them calmly. Favoritism conditioned silence, the habit of self-erasure framed as strength. Hearing those words spoken plainly loosened something I had carried like a rule. I started journaling at night, not to relive events, but to separate facts from feelings. I wrote what happened, and then what I felt, and then what I chose. Seeing the sequence on paper showed me how often my choices had been shaped by avoiding conflict rather than honoring truth. The pages filled slowly with clarity, not anger. I learned to notice when my body tensed at praise and to breathe through it until the tension passed. I practiced receiving acknowledgement without deflecting it. At work, I volunteered to mentor younger soldiers because mentorship is where lessons become useful. I met with them after training, listened to their questions, and told them what I had needed to hear earlier, that documentation is protection, that silence can be strategic, but it should be chosen, not imposed, and that boundaries are not punishments. Watching them apply those lessons reinforced my own. I also learned to rest. I stopped carrying tasks that were not mine and trusted others to own their lanes. That trust felt risky at first, but it held. In sessions, we talked about grief, the quiet kind that comes from realizing a family dynamic will not change. I let myself feel it without trying to fix it. I stopped waiting for an apology that would make everything align and accepted that alignment had already occurred internally. The phrase arrived one evening as I wrote without planning it. I did not overreact. I respected myself. It read like a conclusion and a beginning. Respect is not loud, and it does not require witnesses. It is an agreement you keep with yourself. I noticed changes ripple outward. Conversations felt cleaner because I did not anticipate how to soften my needs. Decisions took less time because I trusted my judgment. I laughed more easily because laughter was no longer a performance. At home, I set firmer boundaries kindly and consistently and watched the anxiety fade when those boundaries held. At work, my leadership felt steadier because it was grounded. Soldiers responded to that steadiness not with praise, but with reliability, and that was enough. Healing looked like mornings without dread and evenings without rehearsals. It looked like choosing peace without apology. When the memory of the ceremony surfaced, it no longer carried heat. It sat where it belonged as a completed chapter. I kept the journal going because clarity likes maintenance. I kept mentoring because purpose deepens when shared. And I kept that sentence close as a compass, not to justify the past, but to guide the future. The first message arrived on a Tuesday evening, the kind of quiet night that invites old habits, and I recognized the tone immediately before I finished reading it. My stepfather wrote carefully, choosing words that sounded reasonable and cooperative, asking if I would be willing to help clarify what had happened so things could move forward. He framed it as closure, not correction, as harmony, not reversal. He said misunderstandings linger and suggested that my voice could calm them. The audacity was not loud, it was polite, and that made it familiar. I did not respond. 2 days later, he called and left a voicemail, keeping his voice measured, apologetic, adjacent, without admitting error. He said he was struggling socially, that people were being distant, and that a simple clarification from me could help restore balance. He did not ask whether I was well. He did not reference the work. He focused on reputation because reputation was what he had lost. I listened once and archived the message. The third attempt came through my mother, who asked gently whether I might consider helping him save face. She said he was embarrassed and that families help each other. I told her I was not available for that and that the record had already been clarified by the appropriate authority. The word appropriate mattered. He then sent a longer email outlining talking points he believed would smooth things over, suggesting language I could use to emphasize teamwork and shared effort. Reading it felt like stepping back into a room I had left years ago, where my role was to make things easier for everyone else. I noticed the old reflex rise and named it and let it pass. I replied once briefly, stating that I would not provide commentary or clarification and that the matter had been addressed officially. I wished him well and closed the door. The attempts escalated not in volume but in urgency. He emphasized consequences he was facing, invitations lost, opportunities closed, and hinted that my refusal was prolonging harm. He positioned himself as the injured party and me as the gatekeeper to relief. That inversion was the final proof that nothing had changed. He needed me to do the labor of repair without acknowledging the cause. I recognized the pattern and felt calm because patterns lose power when named. I documented the contacts, dates times content, and stored them with the rest of the file, not because I planned to use them, but because boundaries are stronger when supported by records. He tried again through an acquaintance who suggested that a private statement could be misunderstood less. I declined politely and consistently. Consistency communicates better than explanation. In therapy, we talked about this moment as the test of new boundaries, and I saw it clearly. Saying no without anger was the work. Saying no without over-explaining was the work. He wanted access, not understanding, and access was no longer available. The need behind his request was obvious, and human fear of being seen accurately when accuracy costs. I could feel compassion without offering compliance. That distinction felt like progress. I returned my focus to routines, mentoring sessions, training plans, quiet dinners, and the life that had grown steadier since the correction. The attempts slowed, then stopped when it became clear that I would not reopen the narrative. I felt no triumph, only confirmation that the choice was right. Audacity returns because it assumes old rules still apply. They did not. I agreed to meet him once, not because I owed him anything, but because clarity sometimes benefits from being witnessed, and because I wanted to choose the ending rather than let it trail off through intermediaries. We met in a neutral place, a quiet coffee shop near the post, where conversations blur into background noise and accountability sharpens because there is nowhere to hide behind formality. He arrived early, sat straight, and folded his hands as if posture could substitute for admission. When I sat down, he began immediately with gratitude for my time, then moved to apology shaped like explanation. He said he had never meant to take anything from me, that his intention had been to celebrate family and teamwork, and that things had simply gone too far. He spoke about misunderstandings and pressure and embarrassment, and how the situation had spiraled beyond his control. He asked again if I would clarify publicly that he had misspoken, that no harm was intended, that we were all aligned. He framed it as a small kindness with a large effect. I listened without interrupting, because interrupting gives energy to words that do not deserve it. When he finished, he waited for my response with the same expectation I had seen my whole life. The expectation that I would make it easier. I did not feel anger. Anger had burned off earlier, leaving a clean resolve. I did not explain the investigation or the records or the process, because explanation invites debate, and debate was not available. I told him calmly that I would not make any statements and that the matter had been addressed by the appropriate authority. He leaned forward and said he understood, but asked whether I could at least acknowledge shared effort in private circles to ease tension. He spoke about how doors had closed and how he felt judged. He said families stand together when things get hard. I let the sentence sit because it revealed the frame he still believed in, that family is a shield rather than a standard. I replied that standing together does not mean distorting reality, and that I would not participate in repairing a reputation at the expense of truth. He sighed and tried again, shifting tone softer, invoking my mother, invoking peace, invoking the future. I noticed the familiar moves and felt grateful that they no longer worked. I said that I was not available to clarify or soften or contextualize, and that my answer would not change. He asked why I was being so rigid, and I answered that I was being consistent. Consistency ended the argument because it removed leverage. He paused, then asked whether I understood how much he had lost. I said yes and meant it, and added that loss follows actions even when intentions are claimed. He asked if I could forgive him, and I said forgiveness was private and unrelated to public correction. He looked at me then with something like disbelief, because he had always conflated my inner work with his external relief. I felt steady and spoke the sentence I had prepared not as a weapon, but as a boundary. I did not take anything from you. I just stopped covering for you. The words landed without heat, and that mattered because heat would have invited counterheat. He went quiet, then nodded as if absorbing a fact he could not contest. He asked one last time whether there was anything he could do, and I said yes, respect the record and the boundary. We stood, and I paid for my coffee because I wanted no sense of obligation to linger. As I walked out, I felt no rush, only closure, because the door had been named and closed deliberately. In the days that followed, he did not reach out again. The intermediaries stopped. The narrative attempts ended. Life continued with the solidity that comes from alignment. At work, I focused on my responsibilities and found satisfaction in small completions. At home, I maintained boundaries gently and watched anxiety recede. The sentence I spoke stayed with me not as a victory line, but as a truth that reorganized my past. Covering for someone is a habit you learn and unlearn. I had unlearned it. When friends asked how the meeting went, I said it was clear. When my mother asked whether things were resolved, I said they were resolved for me. That was enough. The quiet afterward was not emptiness, it was space. Space to choose what I let in. Space to build without interference. Space to keep my name attached to my work and my peace attached to my choices. Would you reopen that door or lock it for good? Peace arrived the way it usually does in my life, not as a parade, but as a series of small confirmations that added up to something solid. The promotion board results came through on a Thursday afternoon ordinary in every way except that my name appeared where it belonged with the effective date and the remarks that reflected work, not drama. There was no speech, no surprise, just the quiet acknowledgement that performance recorded becomes advancement earned. My commander called me into his office, closed the door, and shook my hand once, then returned to the agenda because leadership does not linger on what is already settled. He spoke about expectations and scope, and the responsibilities that would come with the new rank, and I listened, feeling grounded rather than elevated. The transfer followed soon after a lateral move on paper, but a better fit in practice, a billet that matched my strengths and offered room to grow without noise. It came with a new team and a clear mandate, and I accepted without hesitation because clarity had become my compass. Packing my office, I found old notebooks and early plans, and I smiled at how far I had come, not in distance but in posture. At home, the boundaries held. Family access narrowed naturally as schedules shifted and invitations did not arrive. There were no ultimatums and no declarations, just a steady reality that access follows respect, and respect requires truth. My mother adjusted slowly, and I met her where she was without stepping back into old roles. We spoke about ordinary things, weather routines, memories that did not require me to carry anyone else. I did not offer reconciliation, and I did not forbid it either. I chose not to perform it. Peace does not need a script. At work, my days filled with purposeful tasks, mentoring meetings, planning cycles, and the quiet satisfaction of watching younger leaders step into their names. I noticed how my calm influenced the room, how decisions moved cleaner when motives were transparent, and how teams trust leaders who do not ask them to manage family shadows. The past did not vanish, but it stopped steering. I learned to enjoy evenings without scanning my phone and weekends without rehearsing conversations. The transfer brought new rhythms, new colleagues, and a culture that valued documentation and followed through the same values that had protected me. I did not announce my boundaries because boundaries work best when they are lived. When news filtered back that my stepfather had stopped attending gatherings altogether, I felt neither relief nor regret, just distance, and distance was the gift. Emily reached out once with a short message wishing me well, and I replied kindly without reopening anything. Kindness without access is possible. Forgiveness without proximity is allowed. The quiet victory was not the promotion or the transfer, though I earned both. It was the internal shift that made them feel normal rather than compensatory. I no longer needed outcomes to validate my worth because worth had stopped being negotiable. I chose peace, not as avoidance, but as alignment. In therapy, we named it integration, the moment when your actions match your values without effort. I kept mentoring and journaling and honoring routines because maintenance keeps peace alive. On a crisp morning months later, I stood in a new formation. Sunlight, familiar boots, steady and felt present without armor. My name was mine, my work was mine, and my life was not a stage for anyone else. I thought back to the girl who learned to be the easy one and felt compassion, not sorrow. She had survived with the tools she had. Now I had better ones. The army had given me structure, but I had given myself permission. That combination was enough. If you were Sarah, would you have done the same? If you stayed with this story to the end, I want to ask you to pause before the next video starts and sit with what actually happened here. Not the uniform, not the ceremony, not the title, but the choice that came after the noise stopped. Because most of us will never stand in front of a unit while a general corrects the record. But many of us have stood in living rooms, kitchens, offices, churches, or family gatherings where the truth was bent and we were expected to help bend it further. That moment is the real test, not the public exposure, not the consequences for the person who crossed the line, but the private decision that follows when the door opens again and the same person asks you to make things easier for them. That is where this story lives. You watched a woman who spent her childhood being told she was strong learn that strength does not mean silence forever. You watched her choose procedure over reaction and boundaries over revenge. And then you watched the hardest part when the pressure returned quietly, asking for help, asking for clarification, asking for relief that only she could provide. That is where many people fold because folding feels like peace. It feels like being the bigger person. It feels like ending the tension. But peace that requires you to erase yourself is not peace. It is maintenance, and maintenance is exhausting. So here is the question that matters not for comments or algorithms, but for your own life. When someone who benefited from your silence comes back asking you to soften the truth, would you reopen that door or lock it for good? Would you explain again, hoping this time they understand, or would you trust that understanding is not your responsibility? Would you confuse forgiveness with access, or would you allow yourself to forgive privately while keeping your boundaries intact? Many of us were taught that family loyalty means absorbing harm quietly and calling it love. Many of us were praised for being easy, reliable, uncomplaining, and we learned too late that those words can become cages. This story is not about punishing a stepfather or humiliating anyone for sport. It is about what happens when systems of truth finally align with personal boundaries and how calm justice can feel when it is not fueled by anger. The general did not shout. The institution did not rage. The correction happened because the record existed and because someone chose not to interfere with it. And then the most important correction happened when Sarah refused to take on the labor of restoring someone else's reputation. That refusal was not cruelty. It was clarity. Ask yourself where you are still doing unpaid emotional labor to keep someone else comfortable at the expense of your own peace. Ask yourself whose story you are still carrying because you learned early that speaking would cost too much. Ask yourself whether the version of strength you inherited is actually strength or just endurance. If this story stirred something in you, it is probably because you recognize the pattern. The quiet child, the responsible one, the one who handles things, the one who is told you do not need recognition because you are strong. That sentence sounds like praise, but it functions like permission for others to step forward into credit that is not theirs. Strength does not mean you do not need truth. Strength means you can stand in it without flinching. If you have ever left a room feeling smaller so someone else could feel bigger, this story is for you. If you have ever been asked to clarify something that was already clear, this story is for you. If you have ever been told to let it go when letting it go meant letting yourself disappear, this story is for you. So, before you move on, decide what you would do if you were Sarah. Would you choose the short relief of smoothing things over or the long peace of alignment? Would you reopen that door one more time, or would you lock it gently, firmly, without anger, and walk forward? There is no comment requirement here, no right answer for everyone. But there is an honest answer for you. And if this story gave you language for that answer, then it has already done its job.